Somewhere in 2022, in a recording studio or an archive room, Roger Taylor heard a song. He had heard thousands of songs. He had been a drummer in one of the most successful rock bands in the history of British music. He had heard Freddie Mercury's voice more than anyone alive, more than any other person who had been in the room with it. He had been in the studio for Bohemian Rhapsody and Somebody to Love and We Are the Champions and Innuendo and everything in between. He knew what Freddie Mercury's voice sounded like. He had heard it for 20 years, in rooms, through headphones, through speakers, across every album they had made together. And then, in 2022, in an archive, a tape was found. A song called Face It Alone. Recorded in 1988 during the Miracle Sessions, set aside, forgotten, sitting in a box for 34 years, the engineers put the tape on. Roger Taylor sat down. And Freddie Mercury's voice came through the speakers. Not the voice from a record he knew. Not a performance he had heard 1,000 times. Something he had forgotten. Something that had been sitting in a box for 34 years. And Roger Taylor, who had given dozens of interviews about Freddie Mercury in those 34 years, and who had always found the professional distance to keep the grief in the place where professional grief is kept, Roger Taylor heard the voice. And he did not keep the distance. Roger Taylor and Freddie Mercury met before Queen existed. They met at the end of the 1960s, when Freddie was still Farrokh Bulsara and Roger was a dental student who played drums in a band called Smile, and who did not yet know that the person he was about to befriend would become the defining figure of his professional life. They were young. They were both young in the specific way of people who have not yet become what they are going to become, but who already know they are going to become something. They would lie on the floor together, Roger Taylor has said, head to head, on the floor, getting lost in Electric Ladyland, talking about the future.A bottle of wine. Nothing stronger. They were no good at smoking weed, Taylor has said. They shared a sense of fashion, velvet heavy, particular, the specific sartorial confidence of two people who had decided who they were going to be before the world had confirmed it. They shared a passion for Jimi Hendrix. They shared what Roger Taylor has called fat-bottomed ambitions. And when Farrokh Bulsara became Freddie Mercury and joined the band that became Queen, he joined the band that already had Roger Taylor in it. They had been friends before there was a band. The band was built on top of the friendship. For 34 years after November 24th, 1991, Roger Taylor gave interviews about Freddie Mercury. He has said, I remember we were quite tense at Live Aid. He has said, during We Are the Champions, the crowd looked like a whole field of wheat swaying. He has said, Freddie's house was surrounded by photographers. They were like vultures. Utterly shocking. He spoke about albums, tours, specific moments. He gave the warmth without giving the private part. For 34 years. Then, in 2022, in an archive room, the tape was found. The tape was found. Face It Alone, a song from the 1988 Miracle Sessions. Set aside at the time because it was not complete, because the band moved on to other things, because the momentum of an album in progress carries you past the things that don't quite fit yet. Left in a box. Left in an archive. 34 years. And when the Queen production team found it in 2022 and brought it to Brian May and Roger Taylor, the decision was made to listen, to sit down with the engineers and play the tape, to hear what had been in the box for 34 years. Roger Taylor has described the discovery in the words of someone who has chosen them carefully. A little gem from Freddie. We'd kind of forgotten about this track. It's wonderful. A real discovery. It's a very passionate piece. These are the words of someone who has managed the public version of the feeling. Who found, in the professional vocabulary available, the language for what the discovery was. What the discovery was, in the room, the first time the tape played the specific experience of hearing a voice you have not heard in 34 years. saying something you have never heard it say. In the specific quality of 1988, when it was recorded, and you were both young, and the future was still entirely open, that Roger Taylor has not described. Face It Alone is a song about isolation, about the specific experience of facing something so large that no one else can be inside it with you. About the exact condition that Freddie Mercury was in for the last 4 years of his life, living with a diagnosis that he had kept secret. Maintaining the performance of the public Freddie Mercury while carrying a private knowledge that the public Freddie Mercury would have no future. In 1988, when he recorded this vocal, Freddie Mercury had been HIV positive for 1 year. He had been told in 1987. He had not told the band until later. He had told no one outside the innermost circle. He sat in front of a microphone in 1988 and sang, "When something so near and dear to life explodes inside, you feel your soul is set on fire." He sang, "When something so deep and so far and wide falls down beside you." He sang the refrain, "In the end, you have to face it all alone." Whether these were his words specifically or a shared composition, Freddie Mercury was the voice. And the voice was carrying something specific in 1988 that the voice was always carrying, but that this song named more directly than most. And in 2022, in an archive room, Roger Taylor heard the song for the first time in 34 years. He heard the voice. He heard what the voice was carrying. Nobody has described what happened in the archive room when the tape played. Roger Taylor said, "Wonderful.A, real discovery. A very passionate piece. Brian May. Beautiful. Touching. These words went into the press releases and interviews. They are accurate. They are also partial." The complete version, what happened when Freddie Mercury's voice came through the speakers for the first time in 34 years, singing about facing it alone. From 1988, when both of them were still young lives in the archive room, in whatever Roger Taylor's face did when the tape played, in whatever passed between him and Brian May without words. Roger Taylor had managed the professional distance across 34 years and dozens of contexts. In the archive room in 2022, when the tape played, the professional distance was not available. People who love Queen have a version of Roger Taylor crying about Freddie Mercury in their heads. Usually, the 1991 interview, a week after Freddie died, or the tribute concert footage, or the Bohemian Rhapsody documentary moments. People have pointed to these and said, that is when Roger Taylor cried, but none of them produced what people project onto them. Roger Taylor, in every public context carrying this grief, has always found the professional management. He is a drummer. He keeps time. He keeps time even when the time is the time after Freddie Mercury. And then the tape played in 2022. And the time was not kept. And the time was not kept. This is the specific thing about the archive room that makes it different from the interview room and the documentary context in the tribute concert stage. The archive room was not a professional context. There was no journalist. There was no camera. There was Roger Taylor and Brian May and the engineers and the tape and the voice. The professional management, the 34 years of it. The consistent and generous and careful management of the public version of the grief was built for public context, for microphones and cameras, and the specific conditions under which famous people speak about the people they have lost to journalists who will publish what they say. The archive room had none of these conditions. It had a speaker. It had a tape from 1988. It had Freddie Mercury's voice singing about facing it alone. And it had Roger Taylor, who had last been young at the same time as Freddie Mercury. Listening to the thing they had forgotten was in the box. The professional distance is a tool. It works in professional context. In the archive room in 2022, it did not work. Roger Taylor has a 20-foot fiberglass statue of Freddie Mercury in his garden. It came from the We Will Rock You musical. He took it when the show ended. He has said, Freddie would have found its new home hilarious. That is the public version. The private version is, he chose to live with a 20-foot Freddie Mercury in his garden, walking past it, seeing it through the kitchen window in the morning. This is not a performance. It is a choice. Roger Taylor chose to keep the person present in the ordinary world. The archive room tape was another version of this. When it played directly. Freddie Mercury's voice on Face It Alone is the voice of 1988, not the voice of 1991, which the people who were in the room for the final recordings have described as diminished, thinner, a voice working harder to produce what it had once produced without effort. The voice of 1988 was the full voice, the 4-octave instrument, the voice that had filled every stadium it had ever been placed in. The voice that Brian May has described as unlike any other voice, the note that George Michael found at the tribute concert, and that Brian May called pure Freddie, the specific thing that only Freddie Mercury's voice could do. In 1988, that voice sang, "In the end, you have to face it all alone." And in 2022, Roger Taylor heard it again. 4 years later. The voice from before the illness had fully arrived. The voice from the year after the diagnosis, when Freddie Mercury was still choosing to keep the secret and was sitting in front of a microphone in a studio and singing a song about solitude that may or may not have been about the specific solitude he was living inside. Roger Taylor heard the voice of his oldest friend, still full. Still there, still singing, still facing it alone. Still Facing It Alone. The song was released on October 13th, 2022. Roger Taylor called it a little gem from Freddie. He said it was a wonderful, real discovery. He said it was a very passionate piece. Brian May said it was beautiful. It was touching. These are the words that were given to the world. And the world received them and listened to the song and heard Freddie Mercury's voice on a track from 1988 that had been sitting in a box for 34 years. And Roger Taylor, who had heard it first in the archive room, had already been through the experience that produced these words. The words came after. The careful public vocabulary came after. Before the words. The archive room. The tape. The voice. The 34 years of not knowing the song was there. The 34 years of interviews in which Roger Taylor had managed the professional distance. And then the tape played, and the distance was gone. And Roger Taylor heard his oldest friend singing about solitude from a year when both of them were still young enough to believe the future was going to be long. The public version, a little gem from Freddie. The private version, in the archive room, when the tape played, Roger Taylor heard his oldest friend's voice for the first time in 34 years. And he cried. Not in the interview. Not on camera. Not in a professional context. In the archive room. When no one was asking. Roger Taylor's grief is the grief of the oldest friend. Not the biographer. Not the fan. The person who was on the floor of a room in the late 1960s, head-to-head with Farrokh Bulsara, getting lost in Electric Ladyland and talking about the future. Who knew the person before the name. Who was there for every year of what the name produced. And who spent 34 years giving the professional version while keeping the private version private. The statue in the garden. The tape in the archive he did not know was there. Roger Taylor cried about Freddie Mercury. Not in the interview everyone thinks. In the archive room. When the tape played. When the voice came through from 34 years ago, when it was just the music and the memory and nobody asking. Roger Taylor has been asked about Freddie Mercury in hundreds of public contexts over 34 years. In each one, the professional version. Honest, warm, the depth of the loss conveyed without surrendering the private part. He said the things that are true. He kept the private things private. And the moment in the archive room when the tape played and the voice came through and 34 years of distance collapsed into the experience of hearing someone you loved who is gone. That moment was not in a professional context, not documented, not given to a journalist, simply. The moment, the private version, Roger Taylor, cried about Freddie Mercury exactly once in the way the word means. In an archive room, when the tape played. When the voice was just the voice, nobody there to ask him about it. There was nobody there to ask him about it. This is the specific quality of the Roger Taylor story that makes it different from every other account of grief in the Queen archive. Brian May's grief has been extensively documented in interviews, in documentaries, in his own social media posts on the anniversaries. Mary Austin's grief was described once, briefly, with the specific restraint of someone who keeps the private. John Deacon's grief has produced 34 years of public silence, and Roger Taylor has given 34 years of professional interviews in which the grief is present and managed and true. And then there was the archive room, the tape, the voice, the 34 years of not knowing the song was there. Arriving all at once when the tape played, the interview everyone thinks of the 1991 post-death interview, the tribute concert footage, the documentary moments that looked closest to tears. None of those produced what the archive room produced, because none of those contexts had the voice, fresh, from 1988, unheard, sitting in a box for 34 years. When the tape played, Roger Taylor heard Freddie Mercury the way you hear someone you loved, not the public version, not the legend, not the greatest rock singer of his generation, his oldest friend, from the floor of a room in the late 1960s, from before the name. 1988, The Miracle Sessions, a song called Face It Alone, not finished, set aside, 30, 4 years in an archive, 2022, Roger Taylor in a room. The engineers put the tape on, Freddie Mercury's voice came through the speakers. When something so near and dear to life explodes inside, you feel your soul is set on fire. In the end, you have to face it all alone. 30, 4 years of professional interviews, dozens of questions, dozens of answers, the professional distance, the managed grief, the public warmth, all of it true, all of it partial. And then the tape played, and the distance was gone. Roger Taylor heard his oldest friend's voice, from 1988, still full, still there, the voice from before, not. In the interview everyone thinks, not, on camera, not, in a professional context, in the archive room, when the tape played. When it was just the voice and the memory, and nobody asking. Roger Taylor cried about Freddie Mercury exactly once. This is when it was.